Okay, so this was an investigation into the morphological correlations of pectoral girdle with soaring flight, with an overall aim of using this data to assess flight of fossil taxa eventually. So soaring in lay terms would be flying without flapping your wings. Instead of getting your energy from lift, from flapping, you're getting it from the environment. So this is remarkably energy saving compared to flapping flight. So a vulture will achieve resting heart rate within a few minutes of starting soaring. And there are two types used habitually, hence likely to have morphological adaptations. Dynamic, where they get energy from wind shear, which is limited to proaceriform seabirds, the top one there. And static, where they get energy from thermals, and this has evolved independently between 2 and 5 times. The pectoral girdle is part of the shoulder mechanism for moving the wings. So all the major flight muscles originate from this bone complex. There's 6 bones in this: a furcula, a sternum, paired coracoids and paired scapulae. The shape of the bones can indicate differences in muscle morphology, which can then indicate differences in muscle function. We already know that muscles do vary between flight styles. There's a deep layer of pectoralis muscle, the major muscle of downstroke, that's only found in soaring birds, both dynamic and static. And also, bones tend to be a bit better preserved in the fossil record. So, for methods, pick some soaring birds from video footage and literature descriptions and subjected these to canonical variance analysis to test the ability of bone morphology to discriminate between flight styles. There are 2 ways I did this: traditional morphometrics, which are used to capture a simplified 3D bone shape, maybe more useful in the fossil record where things tend to be a bit damaged, and 2D geometric morphometrics, so landmarks and then some semi-landmark outlines, which captured finer details of shape. Unfortunately, in a way, bird fossils are often preserved in 2D. So data was tested with and without correction for allometric effects, so the effects of size on shape. This was done by regressing my shape measurements on a measure of size and then performing my analyses again on the residuals. For this measure of size was a measure of body size for traditional measures and centroid size for geometric. So with the bones, the rostral coracoid, this was really diagnostic. You can see up there, that's great, good separation. Lateral coracoid, pretty diagnostic as well. And traditional morphometrics, also great. So static saurus show a narrow sternal end, so this bit there, a chunkier, straighter furcular end, and a shaft which is straighter in lateral view. And dynamics have the broad sternal end, a medially hooked furcular end, top bit, and have a pretty curved shaft in lateral view. Non-soaring was straight and narrow in lateral view, with a reasonably broad sternal end and a hooked furcular end. Then correcting this for allometry, traditional measures, those aren't very good. Static and non-soaring aren't discriminated well. The lateral coracoid, again, there's a poor discrimination between static and non-soaring. You can see the increased overlap there with the blue and the red. But dynamic, again, are well separated with this curved, narrow coracoid. However, when you look at the geometric morphometrics, rostral coracoid, still great, and the same shape associations as without allometry, which you can see is not actually accounting for that much shape variation. The scapula. Scapula is not a great discriminator. Traditional measures aren't that useful. Unusually, they conflate dynamic and non-soaring birds. And in geometric morphometrics, the best differentiation is between dynamic and everything else, where dynamic birds have this long, gracile scapula. Static and non-soaring, again, aren't particularly well separated from each other, just with non-soaring misidentified as static soaring, despite pretty different flight style. Then you correct for allometry. This doesn't actually account for much shape variation, but as you can see, it does account for an awful lot of discrimination between groups. Traditional measures just cease to discriminate, really, whereas dynamic Still reasonably discriminated, again with the more gracile shape, and static and non-soaring birds, pretty much for muchness. Furcular. Interestingly, this one has often been correlated with soaring flight, and here you're getting good separation on traditional measures, but rostral view, so the front-on view, static and non-soaring are separate, but they completely overlap dynamic. So non-soaring birds have this V-shaped, narrow furcula, and static soaring quite a broad U-shaped furcula, with dynamic expanding the range between the two. Lateral, the land are particularly clustered, and static are misclassified as non-soaring birds, and non-soaring are misclassified as dynamic. The dynamic soaring birds have narrow, pretty curved furcula, and the static have this broad, curved, fairly distinctive, visually, but not mathematically, furcula. Non-soaring is just a spectrum between the two, really. Then, with correcting for allometry, and a huge amount of shape variation is due to allometry in the rostral furcula. And you can see by correcting it that the shape differences are roughly the same, but it's much less exaggerated, and dynamic soarers are just not separate from the non-soaring group. Again, the lateral furcula, this is reduced in terms of separation, with static and dynamic reasonably separated from each other, with the non-soaring overlapping the morphologies between the two. Curvature is not actually that much of a difference between the flight styles once allometry is corrected for in the lateral furcula. The sternum, I thought the sternum was going to be very diagnostic, but turns out that traditional morphometrics only really diagnose the dynamic soarers. Is the lateral view, non-soarers occasionally misidentified as static, effect less pronounced in ventral view, but dynamic are well separated. Again, they're showing more hooked carina with a straighter ventral margin. This bit here, it curves round, and an anteriorly broad carina, anteriorly broad sternal body. The static saurus show a pretty curved carina, which is fairly rectangular body with not much emargination on this posterior margin. The non-soaring have an intermediate carina morphology and a fairly anteriorly narrow sternum with an awful lot of emargination at the posterior margin, which is largely due to owls, I think. So once allometry is corrected for, again, not a lot of shape variation was explained by allometry. And again, the traditional morphometrics only really discriminated dynamic soarings from each of the other two groups. But this correction for allometry has meant that the static and non-soaring groups are no longer very well discriminated from each other. The general interesting change correcting for allometry has produced is that dynamic soarers now have this, that's the wrong button, have an anterior shift of the carina on the sternal body, which has implications for the direction of force of pull of the muscle. In ventral sternum, the static birds, although they overlap more with the non-soaring, are also misclassified as dynamic occasionally. So in conclusion, bones of the pectoral girdle can be used to identify flight style, with the rostral coracoid actually being the one that is really diagnostic. In general, the 2D geometric morphometrics were more predictive of flight style than traditional morphometrics, although interestingly, for the furcula this was reversed. And the dynamic soaring birds had really, really distinctive morphology, much more so than the other two. So while the difference between static and non-soaring was not that great, this difference disappeared if you corrected for allometry, showing that that static soaring birds tend to be very large is actually what's separating them from non-soaring birds. But even despite these two groups, the static and the non-soaring, being not being discriminated very accurately from each other, they do extend into different regions of morphospace, so they are doing some different things, morphologically speaking, though this may not be a particularly good way of identifying them in the fossil record. So this obviously has some more work to be done on it. So what I'd really like to do is investigate the convergent evolution of static soaring. So this has evolved once in eagles and vultures, and then 1 to 4 times in acriorniths, which is a big clade of storks, pelicans, anhingas, etc. And I would like to see if there's morphological convergence. They've converged in their flight behaviour. I'd like to see if this is underlain by some skeletal convergence. Further to this, I would like to, and I have just finished my analysis of the wing skeleton. Obviously, they have to have a flight surface. It's known that the overall wing shape varies with flight style. I'd like to see if the underpinning skeleton varies. And then this bone complex, pectoral girdle, operates as a unit. It's a bit naive to just examine bones individually, so I'd like to look for correlations between the bones. Although one bone individually may not be diagnostic, their associations may be. And then eventually, I'd like to use this to effectively build a morphological library of the pectoral girdle and wing, and take this back into the fossil record to make and test hypotheses of flight style in extinct taxa, and possibly investigate the initial acquisition of soaring flight in modern soaring groups. Thank you.